passages or a similar passage of scripture in Matthew 21. You'll also find this same parable also recorded in Mark chapter 12. But here as we look in Luke, we're going to deal with the issue of property rights. In my home, everyone seems to have some property. My two oldest boys, AJ and Caleb, even this morning, there was an argument over a Pop-Tart. One said, I touched it first, therefore that one, two Pop-Tarts exactly the same, but one said that one belongs to me. Everyone has arguments over property. My boys, AJ and Caleb, they have their property, and my wife, she has ways of conveniently reminding me that what's hers is hers, and what's mine is hers. Everyone has property. It further even amazes me that a 5-month-old who can't buy nothing also has property. If you were to take a bottle and present it in front of this 5-month-old, he would twist, somersault, and turn because he recognizes that that's his property. Everybody has a claim to some property. My question today to each of us here is, why haven't you not claimed yours? God has given you some property. God has given you spiritual property. But what we have to do as we study and learn and grow in God is you have to claim what's been given. And see, sometimes you need to turn, twist, and somersault to claim what you've been given. Sometimes to claim what you've been given, you have to understand that what yours is yours, and then not just what yours is yours. Sometimes what God has given you, you have to sometimes take it from the hands of, I'm talking about the enemy. Sometimes you have to take it from the hands of another. I want to talk about property rights. And see, sometimes you have to understand, like these two little boys, if you touched it first, did not God say everywhere that your foot will trod and he'll give? Sometimes you just have to understand and claim your property. So today, as we look at this parable in Luke chapter 20, what I want us to begin to understand is that God has given you some property. Now I'm not talking about physical property. I'm not talking about the money in your bank account. I'm not talking about the car that you drive. I'm talking about some real valuable, lasting forever for this life and the life to come. God has given you some property. But the interesting thing about property, understand this, property often causes, in fact, most of the wars that have been waged in this world are due, in fact, directly related to property. If we were to look now in current news, you would find that in Syria and Iraq right now, there's a new Islamic state that is establishing, in fact, attempting to establish itself. And what it's really about is property. You find also, even in the Ukraine, where Ukraine, tensions between Ukraine and Russian or pro-Russian rebels, you would find also that war is also waging over property. You would find even more furthermore, if you were to study history, you would find that in World War I and World War II, you would find it all related to property. World War I, there was Otto von Bismarck. In World War II, there was Adolf Hitler. It all related to property. Now, when you begin to talk about wars and property, because understand, God has given you some spiritual property. These wars and property have sometimes caused, in fact, sometimes allowed for some sniping to take place. It's sometimes allowed for some shots to be fired from a direction that you cannot discern. Wars sometimes cause bombs to be landed, in fact, bombs to be placed in your midst. Now, I'm just talking about the spiritual property that God has been giving you, because there's a reason why you go through what you go through. There's a reason why you go through some of the difficulty and some of the hard times. What it really is God is positioning you. In fact, God has given you some property, but you have to make sure that you arrest, hold, grab onto, and don't refuse to let go of the property that God has given you. I know that there'll be some shots that are taken sometimes from places that you can't see, but what you have to understand is that God has given you some property. Stand on the ground that God has given you. Stand on the promise that God has given you. Stand on the word that God has given you, because God has given you some property. God has given you some property, and I want us to understand that in Luke chapter 20, what Jesus is really talking about here, Jesus is talking about property. He's talking about property, but understand, as we understand and think about wars, as Jesus talks about property here, we have to understand with property, see, sometimes there's conflict in terms of dealing with property, but with every conflict, there's also a challenge. Now, I want us to see the conflict and the challenges in the text. When we look at this text, we'll see in verse 1 that there's a conflict. There's a conflict in verse 1 of chapter 20. What we see is it says it came to pass that they came against him, and they came to him asking him a question of authority. Now, it's interesting when you look at who it was that came against Jesus. It says it was the scribes, it was the Pharisees, and it was the elders, and they came against him questioning. They came against him questioning his authority. They said, by what authority do you do these things? Now, Jesus then goes further to explain. In fact, he doesn't explain, but Jesus actually then goes to and talks about John. It says, if you believe that John, the baptism that John gave, he asked them that question as it related to John, and they could not answer. Now, I want you to understand this in terms of you asserting, you claiming your property. See, first thing is we look at these people who came and questioned Jesus' authority. Because sometimes for you to get to your property, to actually have and hold your spiritual property that God has given you, you have to deal with the challenge of authority. Now, as we look at the challenge of authority here, what you see here is this. Jesus did not answer their question because, see this, here, they were asking him about authority on a level they couldn't understand. Let me say it this way. See, you can only understand authority on your level. Therefore, Jesus didn't even answer their question. He goes to give a question on a level that they should understand, but they couldn't even understand that. Now, in terms of you asserting your own property, understand, sometimes people will question you. Sometimes people will come to you and challenge your authority. I want to tell you that if it's yours, sometimes you don't even have to answer. All you have to do is stand on what God has given you. You don't have to answer silly people and irrelevant people when they're challenging what God has given you. You don't have to answer people who come against you and mean you no good. If God has given it to you, it's for you. Stand on what God has said. Stand on what God has done. You have to understand and claim your property. You have to understand. They claimed the property. They came to Jesus. They asked him a question of authority. Now, I told you there's conflict and challenge. Because see, they came to Jesus with a conflict, and what Jesus gave them was a challenge. And see, sometimes you have to do the same thing. It's not for you to answer everybody. It's not for you to respond to everything. Sometimes you just give you the challenge. You tell them, show me the Christ in you. Show me that you can live the word like I live the word. Show me that you can live like I live the word. Show me that you love God like I love God. Sometimes in the conflict, you don't answer, you just give them a challenge. It's about property. There's property. There's conflict and challenge when you look at the text. There's conflict and challenge, but there's also conflict and challenge when you look at verse 19 of chapter 20. When you look at verse 19 of chapter 20, it says the chief priest and the scribes, it says the same hour they came to lay hands on them. Now, it's interesting when you look at it, you see there's a progression when we look at the text. See, it comes in verse 1, they're dealing with this, they challenge his authority. Now, after they challenge his authority, what you find in verse 19 is it's not a challenge of authority, then they challenge his body. It says they attempt to lay hands on him. I want to talk in terms of you asserting and getting hold of your own spiritual property that God has given you. What the enemy will do first, the enemy will challenge your authority. Did he not tell Eve, did God not say? That was a challenge of authority. The enemy comes to you sometime and does the same thing. Comes to you and questions the word of God and says, do you really believe in what God says? That's a challenge of authority. And now, when the challenge of authority doesn't work, what will come after is your body. Well, why is it that you seem to have such a hard time getting up, going to work on a Monday morning? Why is it that you have a hard time even passing your way to church on Sunday? Sometimes it's the enemy raising up against your body. Why is it that disease and infestation attack? It's just the enemy raising up against your body. Because see, if he can't get your authority, he'll come after your body. But what you have to understand is I know that my God is a healer. But you have to and I know that my God is a lifter of hands. But you have to trust and know that God is able to do all things through Christ, which is inside of you. And when you begin to understand and know that, you begin to assert your property. His property rights. In verse 1, there's a challenge. There's a challenge and conflict, and also in verse 19. But also, when you look at verse 27 of this chapter, when you look at verse 27 of the chapter, there's another challenge. When you look at verse 27, it says, "Then came to him certain Sadducees which denied that there is a resurrection, and they asked him." They began to question about the resurrection. So see, what actually happens is the progression of challenges. And Satan challenges. Satan actually attacks you in the same way. He'll come after the authority in terms of your trusting and believing in the word. Then if it's not your trusting and believing in the word, then sometimes he'll attack your body. And then if it's not your body, then he'll attack your theology. Understand, the Sadducees were a group. They were a group in Israel that did not believe in the resurrection. They did not believe that there was anyone that ever would, that ever could get up from the dead. They came and challenged his theology. They came and challenged his understanding of God. And see, if they could have challenged and stole Jesus' theology, they would have stolen your salvation. But I want you to understand, you got to hold fast to the theology. You got to hold fast to your understanding of God. And I don't care if all you got is one good scripture. You hold on to one good scripture. God will prove himself true. God will prove himself strong. God will prove himself mighty. God will prove himself sovereign. You got to hold on to what you know. I don't care if you know as much as the next person. I don't care if you don't know what the next person is. But if you just hold on to what you know, and if what you know is God, and if what you know is Jesus Christ, and if what you know is the power of the Holy Spirit, I want to tell you that God will prove himself strong. It's about property rights. And we have to claim, we have to grab on, we have to hold on to the spiritual property that God has given us. God has given it to you, but sometimes we just let it go. We let it go, but also we mismanage it. As we look at the text, we look at this text in 9, what we find is Jesus gives this parable. As Jesus gives this parable, what we see is we see a certain man who planted a vineyard. He planted a vineyard. In the vineyard, he then allows some tenant farmers. It's kind of like sharecropping. The man came, he planted the crop. He owns the field, and now after he's planted the seed in the crop, he owns the field. Now he gives it to someone else to tend, to take care of, and allow to return a produce, to produce actual fruit is what's happening here in this text. And so the certain man, he planted the vineyard, and then it says at a certain season. Now this certain season is a harvest season. At harvest season, he sends a worker, he sends a servant, he sends someone to the lands that he had given to this sharecropper, given to this tenant farmer. He sends someone to claim. Now I like the way the NIV reads. The NIV actually reads, it says to claim some of the fruit. And see, he came to claim some of the fruit, but then what this tenant farmer does, this tenant farmer, it says that he beat him and sent him away empty. We got to understand that, because understand in terms of the spiritual property that God has given you, sometimes you do the same thing. You're a poor steward over what God has given you, and you mismanage what. I'm not talking about your car, your house, your home. I'm not talking about physical things. I'm talking about the spiritual property that God has given you. Even your soul. Sometimes we mismanage what God has given us. And see, God sent the servant actually to claim a portion, some of. You understand? God didn't want all of it. God just wanted a return on what he had given. Sometimes we will give God the return. So you have to understand in terms of the property rights. In fact, property rights, understand, God has given you as a steward. God has allowed you to produce, but God actually is coming and God just wants a little bit. And I want to tell you today that if you can trust God with a little bit, God will take that little bit and turn that little bit into a lot. Why are we so stingy? Why do we keep our fists so tight? Why do we hold on to what really doesn't belong to us?